Good evening, everyone. My name is Tricia Holt, and I'm the Academic Programs Coordinator here at Cranbrook, as well as an alumni from the photo department. Thanks, guys. Tonight is the second lecture presented by our Fall Critical Studies Fellow, Anthony Byrt. As many of you know, the Critical Studies program is an academy-wide academic program that brings outside thinkers, writers, and critics to reside on our campus for the fall semester. The fellow gives 2 public lectures, holds studio visits, group discussions, and they attend department critiques. The fellow also acts as a touchstone to connect students to the ideas that are timely to the discussions within our departments, but also to the larger world of contemporary art, architecture, and design. And of course, each supplement the programming with a fresh perspective. Anthony Byrt comes to us from Auckland, New Zealand, where he is the director of research at the Whitecliffe College of Art and Design, where he oversees the critical studies components of the MFA program. Anthony is a noted art writer with contributions to such publications as Artforum International and Frieze. In Anthony's first lecture, he presented to us a historical and contemporary view of the trickster figure, citing diverse examples from The Wire, Anonymous, and .com. And Anthony took us through the process of myth-making that is undertaken by these rogue figures. This conversation couldn't be timelier, as today was the International Million Man March by Anonymous. And tonight, I hear we're promised ghosts and magic. So Anthony has, without a doubt, become a member of our family here at Cranbrook. So please help me welcome Anthony Byrt.
Thanks. Thanks for coming along. It's another great turnout, and it's a cold night, so very nice of you to come. I'm not going to talk about Anonymous at all tonight, so I'm not sure whether they got their million men on their march or not, but we'll see. Let me just get this set up, and then we'll get going. For those of you who came in while that video was on, all will be sort of revealed later on in the presentation. Okay, thanks Tricia for that lovely welcome. And thank you all for the response to the first lecture as well. I'm not sure whether to kind of apologise for all the existential crises it caused or kind of congratulate myself, but either way, I'm kind of pleased there was a strong reaction to it. But tonight I am going to change gears a little bit, and I'm actually going to talk about some art, which for some of you might be a little bit surprising after the last one, and for others it might actually come as something of a relief as well. And in a sense, I want to frame tonight's talk as kind of a counterpoint to my previous lecture. So taking the things I talked about then as a kind of contextual background and looking at how contemporary artists with more materially oriented practices might be addressing some of these themes. And actually, rather than picking up in the here and now, I'm going to start where I left off last time, in that kind of parallel technological moment that I was talking about in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but in a way that I hope kind of resonates with our contemporary experience as well. And there are a few reasons I'm doing this. One is because it relates directly to the work of some of the artists I've been working with in the past couple of years. And another is that although I've talked at length last time about how contemporary technology is changing our relationships with images, I think we still have a kind of blindness to the consequences of that. So what I mean by that is we haven't quite developed the tools and criticality we need to really deal with that change. But thirdly, I want to also make the case again tonight that this technological moment we're in now might not be so unique, and that there might be a lot to learn in unravelling the continued consequences of that earlier technological explosion that I'm so preoccupied with. I've also renamed this lecture from its original billing. So its new title is Frontier Spirits, Ghosts, Magic, and Colonial Half-Truths. And I wish I could take the credit for the Frontier Spirits part, but it was actually a title the editors at Frieze gave an article I wrote for them in 2011. So it's one of those very happy instances where your editors make you sound a lot smarter than you actually are. But anyway, I'm going to willfully sort of steal that title for tonight for reasons that I hope will quickly become apparent. Okay, so in the first lecture, I posed a series of speculations about the space between the real and the digital, and the way the figure of the trickster operates in that space to reshape the way we understand the world. Central to my argument was the idea borrowed from Lewis Hyde that the trickster in crossing thresholds like this one creates radical disruption. Tonight I'm going to focus specifically on this idea of crossing thresholds, and I'm going to anchor the discussion in two things. First, the idea of the frontier, which obviously pertains directly to that far-flung corner of the former British Empire that I'm from, but it also directly relates, or it's also directly relevant to America's self-made mythology. And second, I'm going to look at the work of 3 artists from New Zealand and Australia, all of whom use ghosts, magic, and material transformation as ways to traverse liminal spaces. I'm also going to suggest that they reframe modernity and its correlate modernism as traumatic rather than utopian forces. And if nothing else, this seems like a kind of delightfully perverse thing to do in a place like Cranbrook, which is so responsible for so much modernism. Okay, I've got my tiny bottles of water again, so we'll see how we go. So this is Auckland on a reasonably good day. This is my hometown. And as many of you know by now, I spent several years in the UK and Europe before returning to New Zealand in 2011. And after a long time away from my home country, I became transfixed with the way its colonial past still infects everything: the architecture, the cultural interactions, and the structure of its politics. In saying this, I don't mean to suggest at all that New Zealand is a backward-looking place or a place still in thrall to the British motherland. In many ways, and particularly in terms of social fairness and legislation, it's one of the most progressive countries in the world. We were, for example, the first country to give women the vote. We have highly developed social welfare and public education systems, free healthcare. We're resolutely anti-nuclear, and most recently we became one of the few countries to legalise same-sex marriage. And while far from perfect, we nonetheless have one of the better international track records when recognising the importance of New Zealand's First Nation peoples, the Māori, who lived there for around 1,000 years before European settlement and who continue to be acknowledged as essential participants in contemporary New Zealand society. But what I do mean to suggest is that New Zealand is haunted by this past. It's a place where the traumatic release of energy that resulted from a collision of cultures in the 19th century still shapes daily experience. So this is a Treaty of Waitangi protest. The Treaty of Waitangi is kind of our foundational document, a bit like your constitution. It's an agreement between Māori and the British Crown in 1840. And as a nation, New Zealand is a product of a specific 19th century project, the expansion of the British Empire, of which my country is its southernmost articulation. And not surprisingly, given our distance, we were one of the last outposts to be fully colonised, a process that didn't take complete hold until the mid to late 19th century. And as a result, it shares fewer characteristics with the colonisation of, for example, India or even Australia, than it does with a different kind of colonial expansion here in the US, the conquering of the West. And as the remarkable San Francisco-based writer Rebecca Solnit has helped us to understand, it's impossible to see these frontier projects as separate from the technological explosion of the late 19th century that I outlined towards the end of my previous lecture. In her brilliant book, River of Shadows, Edward Muybridge and the Technological Wild West, Solnit demonstrates how the relationships between cartography, photography and rail, as means both of conquest and technological advancement, laid the foundations for the America that we know today. At the heart of her book is the strange figure of Edward Muybridge, a troubled technological magician who left England with one name and eventually arrived in San Francisco with another, who was the victim of a horrific accident on a pre-rail journey across America, possibly suffering brain damage in the process, who murdered the man who'd been sleeping with his wife and was somehow acquitted for the crime, and who, having survived all this, went on to change the way that we viewed images forever. Muybridge's defining achievement, as many of you know, is also one of the 19th century's greatest technological breakthroughs, the invention of motion photography. But it's unlikely that this would have occurred without the patronage of Leland Stanford, a rail magnate who amassed a vast fortune during the relentless drive west. And of course, the consequences of American rail were immense. On the surface, it meant ease of travel, but at a deeper level, it laid the cultural and philosophical tracks for modernity's most iconic nation, America, a place where wealth, opportunity, and social structures were and are completely intertwined with technology's potential to defeat the laws of time, space, and nature. But of course, this payoff came with huge costs: the displacement and slaughter of Native American peoples, and the massive ecological trauma that went with it. But both were collateral damage deemed acceptable in a technological age, when the prospect of Pacific light blinded America to the wounds that it was inflicting on itself. And Stanford, of course, is a name not just synonymous with MyBridge and Rail, but with Californian technology in general. It's interesting to know, however, that the great university he established wasn't in fact founded in his own name, but in his son's, Leland Jr., who died of typhoid at age 16, taken from his parents by a 19th century disease that all the money in the world couldn't prevent. It's interesting too that Stanford's wife, the boy's mother, became obsessed with contacting her son beyond the grave and used a variety of mediums to connect with the boy's spirit. In a parallel narrative, Solnit also recounts the story of Sarah Winchester, whose husband was the son of the inventor of the famous Winchester rifle. Alongside rail, this was the weapon above all others that entered America's technological mythology forever. It's the gun that won the West. But after her husband's passing, Sarah became convinced she was haunted by the ghosts of every soul ever killed by the Winchester rifle. And so to appease these ghosts, she built an enormous rambling mansion in Northern California to house them, which was in a state of constant and largely unplanned construction for almost 40 years. And I think it ended up with around about 200 rooms, a lot of which I think were lost in one of the early 20th century earthquakes in San Francisco, I think, but don't quote me on that. Certainly it got pretty damn big, pretty fast. So right from the start, as Solnit shows us, technology, trauma, and ghosts were specifically Californian bedfellows. More generally, she helps us to understand how modernity, while extraordinary in its speed and sophistication, is inherently traumatic. It's a form of technological, cartographic, and psychic violence that inevitably creates ghosts. And these ghosts still lurk in America's defining industries and cultural exports. So the connection between Stanford University and Silicon Valley, for instance, is well known. And meanwhile, Hollywood is just a few hours south of the spot where Muybridge first captured a horse's trotting gait. So California, in Solnit's brilliant formulation, is haunted as much by modernity's traumatic force as its sunny drive towards technological progress. But on the other side of the Pacific is New Zealand, the modern mythology of which was, as I've already said, largely formed in this same moment. And we do share with the West a certain frontier experience. So we had a scramble for land. Quite coincidentally, I chose this image because it's one of the defining late images of the kind of Māori resistance in New Zealand. There was a settlement called Parihaka in Taranaki, which was a peaceful settlement, and the Māori who were living there were forcefully ejected by British soldiers or by government soldiers. But what's kind of freaky, and if we're talking about ghosts, is that it actually happened on November the 5th, 1881. So, I'm obviously being haunted by something here. But we also had a gold rush in direct parallel to the one in the west here. And we had a collision between one culture hell-bent on a specific form of very land-hungry modernity and a culture that was and is still in pockets ferociously resistant to that. And this traumatic culture clash produced some of the strangest and most complex images of intercultural exchange anywhere in the British Empire. One of the most defining is this photograph of the British Army officer, Horatio Gordon-Robley. And as well as being a professional soldier, Robley was an amateur artist and anthropologist, and his enthusiasm for Māori culture resulted in two defining contributions to New Zealand's colonial history. The first of these was a pair of books, one about Māori tattooing and one about Māori greenstone carving. And the second contribution was his collection of preserved tattooed Māori heads, or moko mokai, as they're known, which we see here, and which he eventually sold to New York's Museum of Natural History. The heads remained there for most of the last century until they were repatriated to New Zealand in the 1990s. And so for me, the Robley image embodies the traumas of colonial contact, which have at their heart a tension between spirituality on the one hand and a rationalism informed by rapid technological and informational developments on the other. But this isn't as straightforward as saying that the spiritual components belong to Māori while the economic and cultural rationalism belong to Europeans, as we'll see shortly. And things are far muddier than this. And just one example is the fact that Robley's otherwise explanatory book on Māori greenstone carving, within that book there are clear attempts to make sense of the forms in relation to some of the world's ancient religions. So Leviticus and the Old Testament are hinted at, and Vishnu is directly mentioned. And all of this is framed by the fact that European settlers knew that Māori and other Polynesians had migrated from somewhere else. It's just that they didn't know where. And indeed this is still a topic of debate, the kind of migratory routes that Polynesians took to actually populate the South Pacific. But interestingly, this connection with the Old Testament and the scattered tribes of Israel was also a claim some Māori prophetic leaders made at the same time in the late 19th century, connecting their own loss of land with a much earlier expulsion, which they learned of via the pervasive presence in New Zealand of Christian missionaries. For those of you who read my essay on Peter Lindebusk that I circulated last time round for the readings, this is Ruakenana, the prophet who I mentioned in that essay, who again is a really defining kind of figure in New Zealand's colonial history. But what matters here, for my purposes at least, is not so much the truth of these events, but rather the narrative strangeness that gets created, which is the direct result of a hybrid spiritual response to a specific colonial trauma. And one of New Zealand's most important contemporary artists, the painter Shane Cotton, has directly taken on these images, not to make sense of the historical record, but in an attempt to understand what they might mean for us here and now. So Cotton, who is a Māori artist himself, emerged in the 1990s and quickly became a poster boy for a particular post-colonial aesthetic. His sepia landscapes, filled with colonial imagery and fragmentary texts, were just politically disruptive enough without ever really threatening to kick down the door. But over the past 10 years, he's developed a far more complex view of colonial contact, exploring the ways in which its extreme consequences, like the trade in human remains, defeated the boundaries between time and space and life and death. And so to achieve this, he's had to lose the landscape altogether from his paintings. The horizon line is gone, and with it the post-colonial blindness that something as loaded as land causes. In its place is a stormy, dark, spray-painted sky. These aren't New Zealand skies, though, but rather non-spaces that become stages for a tight, idiosyncratic vocabulary of forms. Religious or Māori texts, birds, some that seem to be shunted across the sky by unseen forces, and others like hummingbirds that can rewind time by flying backwards. And a lot of biker imagery as well, interestingly. Including these images that vaguely resemble gang patches. And just as an aside, obviously you see the language of the chosen people again, so we have this connection to the kind of Old Testament and this kind of Israelite kind of mythology. It's almost a separate lecture in itself to kind of go through the impact of these things on 20th century New Zealand art and poetry, but you see these, particularly these Old Testament references coming up again and again, and Cotton in these works is clearly riffing on that, as well as gang patches. So again, it helps to have some local knowledge here. For the past 40 years or so in New Zealand, biker gangs have been sources both of criminality and collective identity for Māori men. So the mongrel mob and Black Power are the two most iconic. So here's some mongrel mob patches. Black power. And so, leaving aside the moral and legal questions about criminality and extreme violence, they are nonetheless organisations that occupy precisely the traumatic frontier that I've been talking about across these two lectures. Somewhere beyond the law in a hybrid space where American bike culture, drugs, violence, and traditional Māori culture somehow find ways to merge. And this is a total aside, but as I was drawing these images together, I discovered that with Grand Theft Auto 4, if you've got the PC version, apparently you can make modifications to it, and somebody's made a mongrel mob modification. So if you have GTA 4 in a PC version, you can download the New Zealand chapter. Just weird. But most controversially and most importantly for our discussion here, Cotton has been using moko mokai in his paintings. So those very same heads from the Robley photograph. But this is an important point. It's the Robley photograph rather than the heads themselves that Cotton is using as his source material. And here I want to return briefly to a David Joselit quote that I used in the first lecture. In referring to repatriation debates such as Greece's demand that Britain return the Parthenon marbles, Joselit states that they represent a fundamentalist effort to restore aura at a juncture when the potential of image circulation and the population explosion of images is irreversible. Now, I'd suggest that the debate, particularly in relation to the trade of human remains as a direct result of colonisation, is a little bit more complicated than that short quote implies. Nonetheless, these moko mokai do occupy a tense space between aura and image. As Geraldine Barlow has written of them, in an echo of Joselit, I think, transformed after death, the heads have circulated, first as objects and then as images. They've become ever more complex icons. As representatives of the unburied dead, they speak of tangled histories and continuing struggles for power, control, and respect. So this is one of the heads, obviously, that's been returned from European and American museums. So Cotton's use of the Robley image becomes very ambivalent, somewhere between a semiotic approach and an affective turn. On the one hand, he's openly stated that he wanted to find an image about disconnect, a form wrenched from its system of signification. But they are also unquestionably human, speaking to a direct and physical wrenching. They are, after all, decapitated heads. So he leaves us wondering exactly where the violence is here, in the heads themselves, in Robley's collection and display of them, or in Cotton's own highly mediated appropriation of them for his paintings. And while it's one thing to cast them in a strange kind of stormy heaven, what happens when he overlays them on a perfect printed target? Here, Cotton gives us one of the classic forms of modernism, juxtaposed with one of the most gruesome consequences of modernity. And perhaps these paintings could also be seen as referencing gang patches. And the circle as a form of containment is also an occult vehicle for invoking the dead, as I'll talk about a little bit more shortly. And there is another complicating factor here which greatly affects a straightforward reading either of the heads or of Cotton's use of them. In Māori culture, preserved heads are traditionally objects of reverence rather than horror, but after contact with Europeans, they became objects of trade. In the so-called musket wars of the 1830s, in which Māori tribes were fighting each other, several chiefs tattooed and then killed their own slaves so that their heads could be bartered with Europeans for guns. So as the writer and curator Robert Leonard has pointed out, they slipped into a liminal space. On the one hand, representative of a traditional set of values that European museums wanted to capture before their own forces of modernity erased them altogether, but also representative of a culture prepared to consume itself in the name of strategic advancement. It's interesting too that Leonard, in his excellent recent essay on Cotton, refers to the fact that apparently Cotton's favourite film is Nosferatu, the 1922 German expressionist work that created the vampire genre and which followed on from Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. So if we reflect on the unburied nature of these Māori heads, their occupation of a threshold between life and death, and their status as signifiers of a culture consuming itself, suddenly the vampire analogy starts to stick. And here I want to quote at length from Leonard's essay because I think he makes such an important point in the context of this lecture. Stoker's Victorian characters were modern. They were neophiles. They rode trains, practiced stenography, used typewriters, sent telegrams, dictated their scientific observations onto wax cylinders and transfused blood. But for all their scientific and industrial nous, they were both plagued and excited by a dark occult figure from an earlier aristocratic pre-Enlightenment time. This vampire was a remnant, the last of its kind. Dracula was not the past as appropriated by the present to explain and legitimize itself, but a past that couldn't be assimilated, couldn't be read, a past that exercised its own excessive claims on the present. Stoker was explicit about this. At Castle Dracula, a twitchy Jonathan Harker famously observed, "Unless my senses deceive me, the old centuries had and have powers of their own, which mere modernity cannot kill." Vampires are a sign that modernity is a house built on sand. Leonard then goes on to provide a remarkable quote from the Canadian photographer Jeff Wall. The vampire is neither alive nor dead, but exists in an accursed state of irremediable tension and anxiety. He embodies a certain sense of cosmic grief. The vampire signifies not simply the unwillingness of the old regime to die, but the fear that the new order has unwittingly inherited something corrupted and evil from the old, and is in the process of unconsciously engineering itself around an evil centre. The presence of the phantasm of the vampire in the consciousness of modern liberal men signifies the presence of an unresolved crisis in the creation of the modern era itself. So in Cotton's work, we see a profound vision of what this unresolved crisis might mean for us. His images, sourced on the internet, then patched together and brought to life again in the nowhere space of a stormy sky or a modernist target, don't just illustrate modern and colonial traumas, but acknowledge, in Leonard's words, their excessive claims on the present. Cotton's paintings become two-dimensional seance spaces, agglomerations of horrific histories, contemporary banalities, and formalist strategies that embody precisely the cosmic grief that Wall so eloquently describes. So perhaps we can view this preoccupation with the undead as a specific condition for cultures produced in that moment of 19th century modernity. Cultures that become not just symbols of expansionist progress, but also locations for Wall's cosmic grief. Cultures, in other words, like yours or mine. And so if we're thinking about vampires, ghosts also emerged as a preoccupation and an entertainment in exactly the same moment that technological advancements like electricity and photography transformed our understanding of unseen forces. But the colonial experience has meant that rather than being chased around crumbling castles by anonymous demons, as our British cousins might have been, Australians, New Zealanders, and possibly even Americans are haunted by real-life figures, outsiders who step beyond moral boundaries while they walked amongst us, rebellious natives, cultish prophets, murderers, prostitutes, confidence tricksters, bushrangers, or in your case, gunslingers, card sharps, highway robbers, and so on. This is Ned Kelly, by the way. Amazing haircut, but there you go. This is 1860-something, I think. So our ghosts are foundational characters in our frontier mythology, lurking on the borders between states, laws, and places. And so if we accept just for a moment that these ghosts exist, then these frontier spirits pose unique problems for the supernaturally inclined. Most paranormal activities are exercises in containment. Their organising principles and structures are almost always about defining spaces in which the dead can be corralled while they communicate with the living. And yet our inability to control these spectres of modernity is precisely what makes them so compelling. Carrying the promise of both violence and release, they're the perfect encapsulation of the white settler mentality. they hold up a perilous mirror to the culture they left behind, offering alarming evidence of what can happen when whiteness goes bush. And while they're usually presented as moral warnings against transgression, they're also a source of profound potential, showing just how much productive chaos can be unleashed by crossing Victorian lines. This is a Sydney Nolan painting, which I will talk about shortly. Australian painter. The brilliant Australian artist Michaela Dwyer has made this threshold space her own. Dwyer grew up in Sydney, not far from Cockatoo Island, and this island's inextricably linked to Australia's convict history, first as a prison and later as a reform school for so-called wayward girls, which was a euphemistic way to describe a detention centre for young women who'd ended up on the wrong side of the law, basically. So young prostitutes, young pickpockets, things like that. So this is in the middle of Sydney Harbour, for those of you who don't know the geography of Sydney. It's smack in the middle. It's also where they host the Sydney Biennale, which I'll talk about shortly. But many of Cockatoo Island's past lives coalesce in a single legend, the story of Captain Thunderbolt, aka Fred Ward, and his lover Marianne Bugg. So we see photos of both of them here. Ward, who is a bushranger, who I guess a bushranger, for those of you who don't know, is a kind of Australian frontiersman, or kind of, I guess, parallel of a cowboy in some ways. But so Ward, a bushranger, had been sentenced for cattle rustling, but managed to escape from the island in 1863 with the help of Marianne, who allegedly swam across Sydney's shark-infested harbour to help spring him. The daughter of an Aboriginal mother and an Essex convict turned shepherd, Marianne was a physical manifestation of colonial Australia's shadow side. She was a tough, black, love-struck girl with criminality running in her veins. And so during a residency on Cockatoo Island, Dwyer allowed the dead lovers to possess her thoughts and use them to evoke the female ghosts of Cockatoo Island's past, especially the detained teenage girls, many of whom had suffered considerably during the so-called reform process. The most explicit example of this is a work called Captain Thunderbolt's Sisters, which is a video she made in collaboration with the artist Justine Williams. This is a still from it here. And in it, the two artists clamber around a circular bunker on Cockatoo Island, dressed in striped prison outfits, giant Ned Kelly helmets, and glamorous heels, clanging its metal fixtures with hammers. It's unclear whether we should read them as the artists trying to raise the island's dead, the girls themselves brought back to life, or as interstitial figures, the artists but possessed by the girls' spirits. So Ned Kelly's helmet is a ubiquitous signifier in Australian culture of outlaw freedom, something to be feared but also celebrated. But one of the most intriguing aspects of Kelly's trademark headgear, which we see here, is the way it's caught between the industrial and the homespun, which seems an appropriate appendage for a figure walking the line between myth and modernity. The anonymity it afforded him acted both as a threat and a measure of self-protection against authoritarianism, allowing him to become a phantom in a landscape that was yet to be fully conquered. And this presumably is what drew Australia's greatest 20th century painter to the Sydney Nolan, to the Ned Kelly myth. So Sydney Nolan did a very large cycle of Ned Kelly paintings, one of which is here. But Nolan's fixation with Kelly's helmet seems less an illustration of historical fact than a kind of examination of a modern and a modernist life on the margins. The headgear turning into a Malevich-like void sliced into the Australian outback. Dwyer and Williams' use of the Kelly Thunderbolt archetype sets up a direct conversation with this period of Australian art history. In merging modernism and Aussie folklore, they seem to be following Nolan's lead, but an important distinction is that they knowingly feminise both. By becoming girly proto-formalist bushrangers, they simultaneously undermine the bravado of colonial mythology and 20th century art, infecting both with a transgressive female agency that's such an undervalued aspect of Australia's outlaw past. And these connections between art history, bushrangers, ghosts and feminism were reinforced for me when I sent Dwyer an article about a New Zealand witch who claimed, with some justification it now seems, to be keeping Ned Kelly's skull in one of her kitchen cupboards. Dwyer was, as you might expect, delighted by this story. Ned Kelly's head did go missing, so it is the kind of source of speculation as to where it ended up. A New Zealand witch's kitchen wasn't where they expected to find it, I don't think. But this also points to the elephant in the room, Dwyer's own witchiness. So one could read her installations and performances through the cooler lens of contemporary criticism, or call them for what they actually are. Spaces of invocation filled with invisible energy, inextricably bound to her fascination with modernism's occult implications. So this is best shown by Dwyer's circle works, one of which we see here, which she now includes in almost every exhibition. So this one is from the 2010 Sydney Biennale. It's on Cockatoo Island, so this is installed in one of the large buildings there. And it's a work called An Apparition of a Subtraction, which is a ring of found objects and zeros carved from sandstone blocks which were left over from the construction of her parents' home. But these blocks had actually been quarried on Cockatoo Island. So Dwyer then overlaid the sound of the stone being chipped away, a relentless beat directed through several speakers into the centre of the circle. Her idea was to create a sonic object in the space viewers were invited to stand in, an unseen force that became a physical manifestation of the history of the work's making, a repossession of her own past, a possession of anyone brave enough to cross over into the circle, and a solid reminder of the hard labour inflicted on the island's former convict population. Similarly, in Berlin in 2011, she created a work called Square Cloud Compound, which is a floppy constructivist wonderland made from squares of coloured fabric stretched taut by pantyhose tied to prison-striped lampposts. The posts were like prison guards, tools of torture and surveillance that also had the appearance of gallows. Many of them were also adorned with handmade trinkets, like offerings from the work's spirit prisoners. And so Dwyer has described her use of the circle format as a holding pattern. Adopting the rules of incarceration, the circle creates an architecture of restraint against the work's escape. Nothing and no one is allowed to leave until Dwyer says so. But there are also choreographic parameters within which Dwyer collapses the boundaries between subject, verb, and object. This linguistic reference is deliberate. Dwyer's art is intensely social, and therefore it pays to think about what she's trying to say and how she's trying to say it. And by using a circle to democratise all the key players, which include viewers, history, objects, space, and the artist herself, Dwyer's sentences effectively become jumbled, like she's abandoned cultural rules of speech, or, to make an occult parallel, like she's speaking in tongues. The circle then becomes a defined space of activity in which the conversations between forms matter far more than the forms themselves. And this reversal of focus from the installation's positive solidity to the negative spaces it leaves is similar to the experience of a séance, which invites participants to believe certain arrangements of objects and bodies in space will create electrical fields that enable spirits to transform or reappear. As a result, Dwyer's work is a mode of tangled communication between the dead and the living, and between a colonial history of violence and a present-day audience too comfortably oblivious of that past. But the ghosts of modernism can't be discounted here either, and here we have to follow Dwyer down yet another spiritualist rabbit hole. So Dwyer has long been fascinated by the work of Friedrich Froebel, a crystallographer who went on to create the kindergarten movement in the 1830s. So here we have a circle of children getting ready for their morning classes. And central to Froebel's educational approach were his gifts, or so-called gifts, props such as building blocks and balls that encouraged learning through play. Froebel's gifts transformed early childhood education forever, but as Norman Brosterman argues in his intriguing book Inventing Kindergarten, They might also be the missing link in our understanding of the origins of modernism. So orthodox art history makes much the same claim for modernism that I've been making over these 2 lectures, that a vast technological and informational explosion, which included, as I'm arguing here, colonisation, gave artists and writers the impetus to find new models for art's social, cultural and visual potential. But in Brosterman's scenario, the global dissemination of the kindergarten philosophy in the late 19th century may have been just as important. And as evidence, he points to crucial modernists who were also kindergartners. Kandinsky, Walter Gropius, your very own Frank Lloyd Wright, who claimed late in life that it all started with kindergarten, as well as providing pretty compelling evidence for kindergarten's influence on Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe. So Brosterman states that kindergarten originated as a radical and highly spiritual system of abstract design activities intended to teach the recognition and appreciation of natural harmony. Its ultimate aim was to instill in children an understanding of what an earlier generation would have called the music of the spheres, the mathematically generated logic underlying the ebb and flow of creation. And so not everything in Brosterman's argument sticks, but one angle that certainly does is kindergarten's influence on the Bauhaus. Gropius, Kandinsky, Johannes Itten, Joseph Albers and Paul Klee all taught there and would have all been among the early generations of kindergartners. And perhaps the most direct influence of Froebel on the Bauhaus were the concepts of free work and play in the development of ideas. And also obviously the use of a limited range of geometric forms to kind of do the playing with. So depending on how you look at it, Dwyer, in making her installations, seems possessed either by a twisted Bauhaus or Froebelian spirit. Just as an aside, this is a work by her and an artist collective called Alterbeast, and it's a deconstructed Bauhaus Ouija board. So here's the pointer in the middle, and around the edge of the walls is all the numbers and letters, but in a Bauhaus typeface. And going back to that idea of free work and play, rather than arriving with a concrete plan, Dwyer shows up with objects, sometimes truckloads of them, and allows works to develop in situ, based on a particular relationship between the site and her tight vocabulary of forms, which includes circles, junky modernist objects, crystals, magnets, and geometric blocks that refer directly to Froebel's gifts. This is an installation from a show in Brisbane at the Institute of Modern Art early in 2012. So as a result, Dwyer's installations arguably presented a particular strand of modernism in its purest form, realigning the formalist values of early 20th century art with their spiritualist, playful and ritualistic origins, while also making sure they bend to her will. So Dwyer's complex orchestration of imprisonment, the occult, childhood memory and art history is built on a foundation of conflicted desires, to be both jailer and jailed, to pull viewers in then push them away, to whisper in someone's ear 1 second and then shout in their face the next. And her ability to create such transformative magical spaces might well be because alchemy runs in her blood. Her mother was a Danish silversmith and her father was a scientist who specialised in plastics. It also seems significant that Dwyer herself was an escapee for a time. She briefly ran away to New Zealand while she was a teenager. And Dwyer's most recent and arguably most radical show at the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art in Melbourne placed modernism, crystals, personal history and material transformation at its heart. In the first room, Dwyer painted one of her corner spells, which are concentric rings which evoke a seance circle, a modernist target, a vortex, and an orifice all at once. It seems kind of interesting to me that there's this parallel with Shane Cotton's kind of targets that I was speaking about earlier on as well. This kind of correlation between modernism and the occult here. In the second room, and this is some of the video that you would have seen as you were coming in, which was the heart of the installation, a performance took place on the opening night, 6 anonymous performers donned costumes that turned them into living gold nuggets. So we see the costumes hanging on the back wall there. They then took their seats in a closed circle, seats which were made out of perspex, upon which they attempted to defecate. Meanwhile, 2 masters of ceremony walked around the circle, protective figures or prison guards, depending on how you viewed them. And as Linda Michael has pointed out in the accompanying catalogue, the performance was a logical step for Dwyer, an artist whose work has always been concerned with the intersection between real bodies, ghosts, and material transformation. As Michael states, to shit in public is to do something very much out of place. But here a formal, sober ritual became the containing architecture within which it and we temporarily belonged. It created a space wherein we could recognise our basic interconnectedness and ordinariness. Dwyer has set many collections of objects in circular formation, somehow drawing out their associative power. As with those, this living, breathing circle prompted both a disinterested spectatorial stance and a more primitive response. And then the final room of the installation was dominated by 3 rings, which were scaled-up versions of actual pieces of jewellery by Dwyer's deceased mother. So Dwyer herself wears the original rings. So as with the performers in the previous space, there was a direct, unavoidable connection to real bodies here and real relationships. Golden objects spilled from these rings, glazed forms that in a reversal of the previous room could have been seen as shit perhaps, but also as offspring. It's another more detailed view so you get to see what they look like. And for Dwyer, the rings were pelvic bones as much as orifices, again, spaces of growth and transformation, thresholds to be crossed, voids that must have something pass through them before they gain their ritual and physical significance. So I'm just trying to start something on my tiny screen here. So Dwyer is a remarkable artist and a hugely influential one in New Zealand and Australia, who places trauma, ghosts, memory and alchemy in front of us as confrontations rather than as easy experiences. And the New Zealand artist Steve Carr also uses alchemy in his work, but mixes it with the other side of the magician's coin, illusion. Carr's work has always been about moments of magical transformation, with the artist himself often undergoing the change. But like many magicians, he often can't resist showing us how his tricks are done, as we can see from this work in 2007. I'll just let you watch this for a second. Good. I've seen it so many times, I'm never sure whether it's funny anymore, so I'm pleased that it's... Since 2009, however, Carr has been using matter undergoing radical transformation as a stand-in for himself. And in doing so, he sets up similarly complicated conversations about magic, alchemy, history, and their relationships with our bodies, as Dwyer does. His breakthrough work in this regard was Burnout, which we obviously have on the screen here, in which on an early Auckland morning in the western suburbs, a young man does exactly what the title suggests. But rather than the requisite jump cuts and heavy metal, as one gets on YouTube videos of burnouts, Carr's event is shot at distance against lush New Zealand bush with no sound, a transgression that in Lara Strongman's words becomes a thing of quiet beauty, a drawing with smoke, an inscription in the landscape. We'll just watch it for a minute or so. That guy's one of the great happy accidents of video art. That was an old local guy who just came out to see what was going on and then had it explained to him, and he was sort of like, all right, no worries. But there's a raw transformative physicality to Carr's inscription here. Rubber turning into smoke for no good reason other than for its beautiful, pointless grandeur. It's also an empty act of masculinity. There are no girls, no guitars, and it's 5 a.m. in a landscape caught between suburban nightmare and sublime Kiwi beauty. The landscape, in other words, that most New Zealanders of mine and Carr's generation grew up in. And so with no one to watch, it's also a kind of masturbatory gesture, a young guy getting something pent up out of his system. And after the car fishtails away, there's nothing left but a dissipated cloud of smoke and a slightly disappointed, empty feeling. But in many ways, these two works that I've shown you, Tablecloth Pull and Burnout, are dual precursors to Carr's most important work, screenshots. Across 9 monitors arranged in a 3x3 grid, we see the artist's hand slowly pricking paint-filled balloons against a coloured background. As the pin slips in and each balloon peels back, there's a brief and wondrous moment in which the paint holds its shape and wobbles in midair before coming apart in a sticky mess. And if you just bear with me for a second, I'll quit out of PowerPoint here so I can get a video up of that for you. There we go. So it's Carr's first slow motion project using a phantom camera, which is capable of shooting high definition footage at more than 5,400 frames per second. In Carr's hands, the phantom becomes less a piece of high-tech kit than it is a tool that reveals 2 driving forces in his practice. First, Sorry, I'll give Steve his moment here. He'll be watching this on YouTube in a couple of weeks, so he'll be making sure I'm giving him his moment. First, his desire to make magic, but also show us how it's done. And second, his ability to take a moment of childish pleasure, in this case blowing up a paint bomb, and turn it into something sensual, transformative, and sublime. As Douse Museum director Courtney Johnston has written, with its ultra-slow tempo and doubled physicality, the balloon and pin that you see, the body hinted at, screenshots as unabashedly, gleefully erotic. We dandle the balloon in our own hand, relive the kindergarten delight in heavy, wobbly forms, feel the electric shock as the pin breaks the surface, experience the sudden release of weight that throws our hands apart. In Johnston's response, as much as Carr's trick, there is of course an acutely and absurdly sexual exchange. The work seems as much an effort to delay release as to actually achieve it. And so I know two curators, for instance, who've argued about the work's sexual parameters. The woman curator arguing that it's a metaphor for an attempt to gain mastery over the male orgasm. The male curator arguing the opposite, that it's about conquering the female orgasm. Either way, in Carr's hand, these balloons become organs needing release rather than just rubber repositories for paint. Like Dwyer, Carr taps into modernism's deeper, darker histories here, and American modernism in particular. There's an obvious parody of action painting's splattery bravado, as well as a reference to the minimalist grid in the way that the TVs are arranged. There's also the fact that these are commercial synthetic colours, the interior palette of modern life. And indeed, Carr worked with one of Auckland's leading interior designers to actually do the colour matches. It's also important that the explosions are shown on 32-inch screens, which results in a one-to-one relationship between the viewer's own hands and the artist's, in much the same way that a Donald Judd is, in fact, despite its industrial edges, designed to create specific bodily relationships. The slowing down of time here is also has an important modernist reference for Carr. So the title of the show in which these were first presented, which was Mystical Realism, Modest Gestures, is a modified quote from the filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky, whose long takes, metaphysical narratives and slowing down of time were about reminding viewers of the materiality rather than the illusion of film, making them aware of their own bodies in the process. Okay, you can see all the screenshots on Steve Carr's website if you're so inclined, but they're pretty impressive. Just going to bring up one more video. So Carr's ability to deploy contemporary technology to slow down time creates effects that are both sensual and ethereal, but they're also profoundly transformative, as his most recent work, Hiding Behind the Sun, shows. You're one of the first groups to actually see this work. This is kind of hot off the press. So. The video is simply a piece of found footage of a bubble popping on a cactus, also shot on a Phantom, which Carr acquired from a stock photographer in San Francisco. Yet by stretching it from its original 30 seconds to over 10 minutes, and by blowing it up to cinematic proportions, Carr turns it into a sci-fi epic. And this effect is augmented by the soundtrack, which consists of the sonic movements of the planets recorded during NASA's Voyager mission. So these are electromagnetic waves translated into sound waves. And I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to look at this with the sound, just so we can watch things progress. Okay, so again we have a childlike pleasure, blowing a bubble only to watch it burst, mutate into a fascination that is both childlike and alarmingly adult, our inability to comprehend the mysteries of deep space. It's a double play by Carr that seems to tie perfectly to Froebel's desire, as Brosterman states, to instill in children an understanding of what an earlier generation would have called the music of the spheres, the mathematically generated logic underlying the ebb and flow of creation. This moment of transformation is arguably the most remarkable Carr has ever orchestrated. A bubble sheds its skin, collapses on itself, turns briefly into a black hole, and then disappears into a spread of stars across black space. Like Dwyer's shit, crystals or oversized rings, the disruptive, transformative capacity of the work comes from the fact that this matter is so out of place. This simple bubble shouldn't evoke one of nature's grandest and least understood events, and yet through Carr's trickery, that's exactly what it does. In slowing down time with such extremity, he plays the roles of both magician and physicist in a way not too dissimilar to Muybridge's revelations. His explosion allows us to indulge in the fiction that we might just be getting a brief glimpse of the heart of what the universe is made of, as a bubble folds in on itself with the sad grandeur of a dying star. So where does all of this leave us? In my first lecture, I finished by asking how art could possibly compete in a world where acts carried out by tricksters, wearing masks or lurking in shadows, have such disruptive imaginary force. In a sense, tonight's lecture might offer something of an answer. Not the only answer, sure, but a possible answer all the same. Because even if they aren't dealing with the particular politics of our contemporary moment, we've seen how all three artists use trickery, masquerade, performance, and even violence in their work. But most of all, they're crosses of thresholds, between the living and the dead, between then and now, between the heavens and the earth. For Cotton and Dwyer in particular, our technological and modern history isn't treated as a series of machine-made events in the past, but as powerful physical presences that exist here and now. Both show us how modernity and modernism turn into dual traumatic forces out on the frontier. And perhaps as an antidote to my first lecture, all three artists overemphasize the materiality of their work, its thingness, its stickiness, its ability to be pierced, touched, and dismembered. But what matters here, as Dwyer's performance or Carr's slow-motion films show us, is not so much seeing material transformed as seeing material on a threshold, stuff undergoing extreme transformation. In revealing these forces of radical change, they remind us that our own bodies are sites of traumatic and wondrous experience, and that in a digitized, image-saturated world, our basest responses, when encountering matter out of place or watching the quiet wonder of magic, highlight our interconnectedness just as much as any digital platform can. All three artists show us that with entangled networks of images and ideas, there is entrapment, of course, but there is also the promise of release, a sense that every force of containment is merely a border for those brave enough to pursue radical transformation to cross. Thank you very much.